In the dense darkness of a filthy alley, the sound of footsteps echoed loudly on the ground. Jake, with cold eyes and rough hands, dragged Shadow, a hunting dog that was once his pride. But now, Shadow was nothing more than a breathing corpse in Jake's eyes. Useless. I gave you a chance, but you're just a loser, Jake hissed, his voice filled with contempt. Shadow, his body covered in wounds, could only bow his head. His eyes no longer shone with pride as before. Only silence remained, as if he had grown accustomed to enduring. Jake forcefully removed the leash and flung Shadow into the corner of the alley, like discarding a broken object. "Get lost. Don't let me see you again," he said before turning his back and walking away without a single glance back. Shadow collapsed onto the cold ground, his breathing faint. His right leg throbbed with pain, blood still oozing from unhealed bites. His mind hazy, Shadow struggled to stand, but was too exhausted. In the darkness, his brown eyes reflected a deep sadness, as if questioning himself. What did I do wrong? Why did they abandon me? Laughter echoed from afar, followed by soft footsteps. Lucy, a skinny little girl with messy hair, stepped into the alley. Her eyes lit up when she saw Shadow, but then quickly turned to sympathy. "Poor dog, who would do this to you?" Lucy murmured, her voice trembling. Shadow looked up, his gaze weary but holding a glimmer of hope. Lucy slowly approached, tearing apart the small piece of bread left in her hand. "Eat it, it's okay," she whispered. Shadow hesitated, but as he sensed the kindness in Lucy's eyes, he lowered his head and ate the crumbs, his gaze softening. In that moment, the darkness seemed to fade slightly, giving way to a faint glimmer of light, a new spark of hope beginning to kindle. Darkness shrouded the alley, leaving only the pale glow of the street lamp casting faint shadows. Shadow lay motionless, each wheezing breath coming in broken gasps. Lucy, clutching her old, tattered coat, sat down beside the dog. Her heart was in turmoil. What should I do? Lucy wondered, her worried gaze drifting over Shadow's frail, injury-ridden body. She bit her lip, her trembling hand gently stroking the matted, bloodied fur. "You'll be okay," she whispered, her voice shaky as if trying to reassure herself. Shadow stirred slightly at the touch of her small hand. For the first time in days, he didn't feel pain or rejection. Instead, there was something else, something foreign yet soothing, a tenderness he had never known. Shadow weakly lifted his eyes to look at Lucy. In his brown eyes, there was fragility, but also a faint glimmer of hope. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" Lucy asked softly. She glanced around, biting her lip as she realized that leaving Shadow here would mean certain death for him tonight. "But what can I do? My family is struggling so much already. Mom won't agree." She lowered her head, her hand unconsciously tightening around her coat. But then her eyes fell on Shadow again, the large yet battered dog. Lucy stood up, her heart filled with determination. "All right, I can't let you die here," she said, her voice more resolute. She removed her scarf and gently wrapped it around the deep wound on Shadow's leg to stop the bleeding. Shadow flinched but then remained still, as though he understood the little girl was trying to help him. "I just need to get him home first, as long as Mom doesn't find out," Lucy thought to herself, tugging at Shadow to get him to his feet. Shadow stumbled, but with Lucy's encouragement, he managed to stagger forward, step by step. Lucy's back was drenched in sweat despite the cold night air, but she didn't stop. Step by step, they left the alley, heading toward the small house tucked deep in the poor neighborhood. On the way, Lucy avoided the neighbor's eyes. If she were caught bringing an injured stray dog home, trouble would be inevitable. Shadow, though exhausted, pushed himself to keep moving, his legs occasionally buckling, but always rising again. Near the house, Lucy stopped. She peered through the window. Inside, her mother, Mrs. Helen, lay on the old wooden bed, her frail frame barely visible beneath the blankets. The dim yellow light cast a pale glow over her sickly face. "I can't let Mom find out about this," Lucy thought. But then she shook her head. "No, I'll figure something out." Lucy opened the door quietly. "Come on in," she whispered to Shadow, guiding him to a corner near the fireplace. She pulled out an old cloth and gently cleaned the mud and blood from Shadow's body. "Don't make a sound," Lucy whispered, her eyes filled with worry but also a hint of tenderness. Shadow lowered his head, his breathing steadier now. "You're just a victim too, aren't you?" Lucy whispered, her voice choking. "Just like me, just like Mom?" Shadow didn't reply, but his gaze softened. In the dim light of the lamp, Lucy and Shadow shared a moment of quiet, a connection between two broken souls finding solace in one another. That night, Lucy sat beside Shadow, waiting until he fell asleep. In her heart, a thought began to take shape. "No matter what happens, I won't abandon you." Beside her, Shadow shifted slightly, feeling for the first time in days the warmth of a true friend. A fragile, yet powerful bond of friendship had begun to blossom. The slow morning light seeped into the old house, dim rays filtering through the gaps in the decayed wooden walls. Lucy woke with a start at the sound of her mother, Mrs. Helen, walking in the next room. Shadow lay still, his eyes half open, as if sensing Lucy's unease. "Mom must not find out," Lucy thought to herself, clutching the cloth wrapped around Shadow's head to keep him warm. Mrs. Helen, frail and thin, stepped out of her bedroom. Her tired eyes glanced at Lucy. "You're up early?" she asked, her voice hoarse from illness. But her gaze froze when it landed on Shadow curled up in the corner of the room. "Lucy, what is this?" Her voice grew stern. "Mom, please don't be angry. I found him injured and abandoned on the street. I couldn't just let him die there." Lucy stammered, her eyes full of pleading. "Lucy," Mrs. Helen almost shouted, but a fit of coughing overtook her as she clutched her chest. Lucy rushed to her side, asking anxiously, "Are you okay, Mom? Please don't be upset. I just wanted to help him." Shadow, sensing the tension, tried to get up and approach them, but the pain from his wounds made him stagger. Helen looked at Shadow, her expression a mix of frustration and worry. "We barely have enough to eat. You brought a stray dog home. How do you expect to care for it? What if it's sick? What if it bites you?" Helen scolded, but her voice weakened, losing its initial sharpness. Lucy lowered her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mom, I couldn't abandon him. I promise I'll take care of him myself. He has no one, Mom. He's just like us." Lucy's words made Helen pause. Her eyes slowly moved to Shadow, now lying at Lucy's feet, his sad yet gentle eyes watching the two of them. Helen sighed and sank into the old wooden chair. "Just like us," she repeated, her voice trembling. She recalled the harsh days after her husband's death, when she and Lucy had been plunged into poverty, struggling to survive. Helen looked at Lucy, her daughter's determined gaze making her hesitate. Finally, she said, "All right, but you must promise me he won't bother the neighbors. If anyone finds out we're keeping a dog in our condition, they'll ridicule me." Lucy nodded eagerly, her face lighting up. "I promise. I'll take care of him. Don't worry, Mom." The rest of the day, Lucy was tirelessly busy tending to Shadow. She found an old cloth to make a bed for him and secretly asked the neighbors for leftover food to share with Shadow. "Come on, you have to get better," Lucy whispered, stroking Shadow's head. "You're strong, aren't you?" Shadow gently licked her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. Yet deep inside, he carried a lingering fear. Was this truly a home, or just a fleeting refuge? At night, when the house grew quiet, Helen lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her occasional coughs broke the silence. She couldn't sleep. Her mind was a storm of exhaustion from illness, worries about Lucy's future, and fears about the added burden of another being in their already deprived home. But somewhere deep in her heart, she felt that Shadow's presence might bring about a change. In the corner of the room, Shadow lay curled up on the old cloth. Lucy had fallen asleep beside him, her hands still resting on his body. Shadow shifted slightly, his eyes reflecting a faint glimmer of hope, the first sense of peace after days of abandonment. In the stillness of the night, three lonely souls found a trace of warmth in one another, though the road ahead remained fraught with hardship. The pale golden sunlight streamed through the worn-out window, shining onto Shadow's brown eyes. The dog stirred slightly, trying to stand despite the pain from the wound on its leg. Lucy sat next to him, carefully unwrapping the bandage around the injury. "You're getting better, Shadow, but you need to be patient, okay?" Lucy said softly, as if soothing a child. Shadow lowered his head and gently licked her hand as a gesture of gratitude. "Well, I guess Mom's getting used to having you here," Lucy chuckled softly. But this peace didn't last long. In another neighborhood, Jake sat in a dimly lit bar, his face scowling. He slammed his hand on the table, causing the glass of liquor to spill over. "Damn it, that dog is worth a fortune. I can't just let it go." Sitting across from Jake was Tommy, a boy with a cunning look and a sly smile. "I told you I saw it with that girl Lucy. She brought the dog home. But are you sure you want it back? That dog is seriously injured." Jake smirked, his gaze icy. "Injured? So what? I just need to sell it. It doesn't have to be healthy. If you help me find it, I'll pay you." Tommy hesitated, but the temptation of Jake's promised money made him nod. That afternoon, Lucy took Shadow to the backyard. She wanted to help him move around a bit to recover faster. "Don't worry, no one will see," she whispered, her eyes darting around cautiously. Shadow moved slowly, his legs still limping. Lucy smiled encouragingly. "Good job. You're getting better." But just then, a mocking laugh broke the silence. Well, if it isn't little Lucy and her stray dog." Lucy spun around to see Tommy standing in the distance, hands in his pockets, his eyes full of scorn. She stepped back, shielding Shadow. "What do you want, Tommy?" Tommy shrugged and approached. "I just wanted to see what makes this dog so special that you risked everything to keep it. But I think Jake would want it more than you do." Lucy turned pale. "No, Tommy, don't tell him. Please. It hasn't done anything wrong." "Well, that depends on what you've got to offer," Tommy said, his smile sinister. Shadow stood beside Lucy, sensing the threat. Though still weak, he growled, his sharp eyes fixed on Tommy. "You can't take him away!" Lucy shouted, gripping the makeshift leash tightly. Tommy froze, fear flashing in his eyes as Shadow stepped forward, limping but exuding an air of authority. "All right, kid, but I can't promise Jake won't come looking for him himself." Tommy walked away, but Lucy knew this wasn't over. She hugged Shadow tightly, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do, Shadow? If he comes, Mom won't let you stay." Shadow remained silent, lowering his head against Lucy as if to reassure her. But deep in his brown eyes was a fierce determination. He wouldn't let anything harm this girl. That night, Lucy told her mother everything. Helen remained silent for a long time, her eyes filled with worry. "Lucy, if that man comes here, we can't protect him. Do you understand? We can barely take care of ourselves." Lucy burst into tears, clutching her mother's hand. "But Mom, I can't let them take him. They'll kill him. I promise I'll do everything. Just let him stay." Helen looked at her small but resolute daughter. Her heart broke. She didn't want to refuse, but reality was harsh. Finally, she sighed and patted Lucy's head. "We'll try, but if things get worse, you must promise to listen to me." Lucy nodded, tears still streaming. In the corner of the room, Shadow lay still, his ears twitching slightly. He knew things were about to get tougher, but he also knew that this time he wasn't alone. The night fell, bringing with it an anxious silence. Inside the small house, Lucy sat beside Shadow, her eyes never leaving the front door. Her mind was a whirlwind of Tommy's threats. What should I do? If Jake really comes? No, I can't let Shadow fall into his hands, Lucy thought, her hand unconsciously tightening the makeshift leash around Shadow's neck. Mrs. Helen entered the room, placing a hand on Lucy's shoulder. "You can't keep this dog here forever, Lucy. If that man comes, we won't be able to protect it," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. Lucy looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "But Mom, it is nowhere else to go. It's just like me. If I didn't have you, I wouldn't know what to do either." Helen froze, Lucy's words leaving her speechless. She looked at Shadow, the large dog curled up at her daughter's feet, its eyes shining with loyalty and an indescribable sadness. She's right, Helen thought. But what can I do? At dawn, a loud knock shattered the fragile peace. Lucy startled awake, her heart pounding. Shadow sprang to his feet, growling lowly, his ears alert and tense. "Lucy, get to the room with me now," Helen ordered urgently. Lucy wanted to protest, but her mother's stern look left no room for argument. "Shadow, don't let them take you," she whispered, hugging him one last time before running to her room. Helen opened the door, and just as expected, Jake stood outside, with Tommy behind him. "I'm here to take back my dog," Jake said coldly. "That dog isn't yours anymore. You abandoned it," Helen retorted, blocking the doorway. Jake smirked. "Abandoned? No, it's my property. You have no right to keep it." Behind him, Tommy avoided eye contact, clearly feeling guilty. "Uncle Jake, maybe we should just let them be," he mumbled, but Jake shot him a glare sharp as a knife, silencing him. Inside, Lucy hid behind the door, peeking out. She saw her mother trying to stop Jake, but Helen was too frail. Lucy knew she couldn't stay still. "Shadow, we have to go now," Lucy whispered. She removed Shadow's leash and led him to the back door. But Jake wasn't easily fooled. He caught sight of the two slipping out and immediately shouted, "They're running!" Lucy gripped the leash tightly, running as fast as she could down the dark alley. Shadow followed, despite his injured leg, never slowing down. Jake and Tommy chased close behind, their footsteps echoing loudly. "Stop, you brat!" Jake bellowed. Lucy turned back, tears streaming down her face. "I won't let you take him." Shadow skidded to a stop, growling and ready to charge at Jake if necessary. But Lucy gently tugged the leash, her voice pleading. "No, Shadow, we can't fight. You're not strong enough." Tommy, witnessing the scene, finally couldn't take it anymore. "Uncle Jake, stop it. Let them go," he shouted. Jake turned, glaring at Tommy. "What did you just say? That dog doesn't deserve this. Neither does the girl. All you care about is money." Tommy yelled, his voice shaking. Jake, enraged, was about to lunge at Tommy, but just then, the figure of a patrolling police officer appeared at the end of the alley. Jake froze, immediately retreating. "This isn't over," he muttered before disappearing. Lucy and Shadow ran far from the alley, reaching a quiet, desolate field. She hugged Shadow tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You did great, Shadow. We're safe now." Shadow lay down beside her, his eyes softening. Despite the exhaustion and pain, he felt at peace. In the dark of night, two small souls found strength in each other. But Lucy knew their journey was far from over, and danger still lurked ahead. The night sky began to pour rain, with icy drops falling and turning the ground into mud. Lucy led Shadow to find shelter in an old warehouse at the edge of the neighborhood, a place that had long been abandoned. The rotting wooden door creaked as the little girl struggled to open it. "Come in here, Shadow. At least this place will keep you dry," Lucy said, gently tugging on Shadow's leash. Shadow, though exhausted, obediently stepped inside. His eyes scanned the surroundings, his ears perked up, alert. The warehouse was pitch dark, with only a few faint rays of light filtering through the cracks in the roof. Lucy spread her old coat on the ground, making a temporary bed for Shadow. "Get some rest, will you? I'll protect you, I promise," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and fatigue. But in the darkness, danger was lurking. Not far away, Jake, with Tommy trailing behind him, had tracked Lucy and Shadow's trail. "They've hidden in there," Jake sneered, his eyes full of cunning. "Uncle Jake, is this really necessary? She's just a kid, and that dog, it's not worth much," Tommy muttered timidly. Jake glared at him. "Shut your mouth. I've wasted enough time because of that dog. I have to take back what's mine." Tommy bit his lip and lowered his head. His conscience was torn, but his fear of Jake kept him silent. Inside the warehouse, Lucy sat close to Shadow, feeling the warmth of the large dog. She tried not to think about Jake coming after them, but the worry invaded her thoughts. "Lucy," Shadow seemed to want to say something through his sad brown eyes, but he only sighed softly, his ears twitching as he heard footsteps approaching from afar. Lucy jumped to her feet as the door was violently kicked open. Jake stepped in, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "Enough, kid. Hand over the dog," Jake snarled, stepping closer. "No, He doesn't belong to you. He's my friend," Lucy shouted, standing protectively in front of Shadow, though her hands were trembling. Jake scoffed. "A friend? You call a dog your friend? You're an idiot." Shadow growled, trying to stand, but his legs trembled from exhaustion. Lucy turned back to him, gently stroking his head, whispering, "Don't try. I won't let him hurt you." Tommy stood outside the door, watching the scene unfold. Lucy's eyes shone with determination and fear, while Shadow, despite his weakness, tried to protect her. Finally, Tommy's conscience prevailed. "Uncle Jake, stop!" Tommy shouted, stepping forward to block Jake's path. "What are you doing?" Jake roared, his voice filled with rage. "That dog has suffered enough. So has the girl. We don't need to do this," Tommy said, his eyes brimming with regret. Jake wouldn't listen. He shoved Tommy aside and lunged toward Lucy. "You think you can stop me, you little brat?" But just as Jake advanced, Shadow summoned his last ounce of strength, leaping up and sinking his sharp teeth into Jake's arm. Jake screamed in pain, flailing to free himself from Shadow's grip. In the chaos, Tommy grabbed Lucy's hand and pulled her out. "Hurry! We need to get out before he recovers." Lucy hesitated, glancing back at Shadow. But Tommy shouted, "Shadow will follow. Go now!" Shadow, despite his pain and exhaustion, limped after them, his eyes filled with determination. The three of them escaped the warehouse as the rain poured harder. Jake lay on the ground, writhing in pain and rage. "This isn't over," he muttered, his eyes burning with hatred. Outside, Lucy hugged Shadow tightly, her tears blending with the rain. "I won't let anyone hurt you again, Shadow. I swear." Shadow rested his head against her, as if to say, "I know, and I will always protect you." In the cold, rainy night, three small souls, a stray dog, a resilient girl, and a boy rediscovering his conscience, embarked on a new journey, even as dangers awaited ahead. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere remained cold and damp. Lucy, Tommy, and Shadow hid under a large tree, far from the barn. Lucy curled up, her small hands hugging Shadow, while Tommy stood nearby, his worried eyes darting around as if afraid Jake would come after them. "Tommy, do you think he'll let us go?" Lucy whispered weakly. Tommy stayed silent. He knew Jake wasn't someone who gave up easily, but looking at Lucy's tired and anxious face, he couldn't bear to tell her the truth. I'm not sure, but I'll help you. We'll find a way to protect Shadow." Lucy nodded, though her heart remained heavy with unease. Shadow, lying at her feet, lifted his head slightly, his brown eyes gazing at her as if to say, "Everything will be all right." The faint dawn began to break, casting a pale light on the damp scenery left by the rain. The three started moving, searching for a safer place to hide. Lucy carefully helped Shadow walk while Tommy led the way. "We should head to the forest near the outskirts. It'll be harder for Jake to find us there," Tommy suggested. Lucy nodded, but Shadow's steps grew heavier with every passing moment. He had lost a lot of blood and was utterly exhausted after days of running. "Shadow, hang in there. You have to," Lucy whispered, her voice choking. Shadow stumbled, his legs trembling, but he kept moving as if his determination to protect Lucy was the only strength he had left. As they approached the forest, a piercing sound rang out behind them. Lucy turned around to see Jake appearing in the distance, his eyes burning with rage. "Damn it, there they are!" he shouted, speeding up to chase them. "Run!" Tommy yelled, grabbing Lucy's hand. Lucy hesitated, but Tommy's pleading eyes left her no choice. "Shadow, hurry!" she called, but Shadow's legs had given out. The dog stood still, turning his back to Lucy and facing Jake. A deep growl rumbled from his throat, a declaration of defiance. "No, Shadow, don't do this. You can't," Lucy screamed, tears streaming down her face. Shadow didn't turn back. He only looked at Lucy one last time, his eyes gentle but full of resolve. "Go. I'll protect you." Jake rushed forward, and Shadow let out a ferocious growl, leaping to block his path. A fierce struggle broke out. Shadow, though weak, used every ounce of strength he had left to fight Jake. Lucy stood at a distance, tears streaming down her face. "Tommy, I can't leave him. I can't," she cried out. "Lucy, if you go back, both of you will be in danger. I'll figure something out, but you have to go now," Tommy shouted, his voice trembling. Lucy's hands shook as she clutched her chest. "Shadow, don't do this, don't leave me," she whispered. Meanwhile, Shadow bit down hard on Jake's arm, causing him to fall. But Jake wouldn't give up. He pulled out a stick and struck Shadow hard. Despite the pain, Shadow refused to move, not letting Jake get any closer to Lucy. He knew this was his final mission, to protect the girl who had saved him when no one else would. While Jake was focused on Shadow, Tommy quietly picked up a large rock. With all his strength, he hurled it at Jake, causing him to lose his balance and fall. "Run now, Lucy," Tommy shouted. Lucy hesitated, but finally, she obeyed Tommy and ran deep into the forest. Before disappearing from sight, she looked back at Shadow one last time. He stood amidst the fight, battered and bloodied, but his eyes still burned brightly, as if to say, "Go, I'll always be with you." As Lucy and Tommy ran farther, Shadow's figure gradually faded into the mist. Lucy's heart ached, but she knew he had sacrificed himself for her safety. "Shadow, I'll never forget you, never," she whispered, her tears blending with the icy wind. In that moment, Shadow was no longer just a dog to her. He was a friend, a hero, and her family. No matter what happened, she would ensure his sacrifice was not in vain. The pale sunlight shone down on the forest, filtering through the lush green foliage. Lucy and Tommy had run deep into the woods, Lucy's small legs trembling with exhaustion. Her breath came in gasps, but her concern for Shadow kept her going. "Tommy, we have to go back. I can't leave Shadow there alone," Lucy sobbed, her reddened eyes full of determination. Tommy, also panting, turned and grabbed Lucy by the shoulders. "Lucy, listen to me. If you go back, Jake will catch both of us. Shadow chose to stay to protect you. We need to find help." Lucy froze, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But if he's hurt, if he doesn't make it?" Tommy looked deep into Lucy's eyes, trying to keep his voice calm despite his own fear. "Shadow is strong, Lucy. He fought till the end for you. You have to trust him." Lucy remained silent, her small hands clutching the collar she had kept as a keepsake. "I won't give up. I'll find a way to save him, Tommy." They continued through the forest until the sunlight pierced through the dense canopy, signaling morning. Lucy and Tommy stopped by a small stream to rest. Lucy gently splashed cool water on her pale face, her heart aching at the thought of Shadow. "Tommy, if I lose Shadow, I don't know what I'll do. He's the only friend I have," Lucy said, her voice choked with emotion. Tommy looked at her, his eyes full of sympathy. "You won't lose Shadow. He's an amazing friend, and I believe he'll always be with you, no matter what happens." At that moment, a sound came from the distance. Lucy and Tommy froze, their hearts pounding. From the bushes, a familiar figure limped out. "Shadow," Lucy cried, her voice breaking with a mix of joy and worry. The large dog, his body covered in wounds and exhaustion, gazed at Lucy with eyes that still sparkled. Shadow trudged forward, each step heavy and unsteady from the fight. Lucy rushed over, kneeling beside Shadow and wrapping her arms around his neck. "Shadow, I knew you'd come back. I knew you wouldn't leave me." Shadow whimpered softly, pressing his head against Lucy's chest as if to reassure her. Lucy's tears fell onto his dark fur, and in that moment, all the pain seemed to fade away. Tommy stood watching, his heart relieved, but he quickly realized Shadow needed care immediately. "Lucy, we have to find help. Shadow can't go much farther." Lucy nodded, wiping her tears. "But who will help us? I don't have any money, and no one here cares about a stray dog. Don't you remember? Shadow has proven he's not just a dog. I'm sure someone will help if they know your story." Lucy hesitated, but the determination in Tommy's eyes made her nod. "Okay, we'll try." They led Shadow to a small village near the forest. Lucy and Tommy knocked on door after door, sharing their story. At first, many people refused, but as they heard about Shadow's sacrifice, compassion began to spread. An elderly farmer, with a kind smile, finally agreed to help. "This dog is special. I'll call the vet to check on him," he said, patting Lucy's head in reassurance. Lucy watched as Shadow was taken inside, her heart brimming with hope. Shadow, you have to be strong, okay? I'll always be here. I won't leave you. As night fell, Lucy sat by Shadow's side, the warm glow of an oil lamp illuminating her face. Shadow, still weak, stirred slightly, his gentle brown eyes meeting Lucy's. I'll never let you get hurt again, Shadow. We'll face everything together, Lucy whispered, her voice small but resolute. To Lucy, Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of friendship, loyalty, and hope, things she never thought she would find in such a harsh world. The morning light crept through the small window, shining down into the little room where Shadow was lying. His wounds had been carefully bandaged, and his breathing was steadier. Lucy sat beside him, her small hand stroking Shadow's dark fur, her eyes glowing with hope. Shadow, you're amazing. You fought for me, for us, Lucy whispered. Now I'll take care of you. I promise. Tommy walked in with a loaf of bread and a small bottle of water. Lucy, you need to eat something. We still have a long road ahead. Lucy nodded, but her gaze never left Shadow. I just want him to get better, Tommy. If Shadow is okay, I can do anything. Tommy placed a hand on Lucy's shoulder. We'll find a way, but you have to think bigger. You can't keep running forever. Jake won't stop. Tommy's words made Lucy fall silent. She knew he was right. Even though they had escaped Jake's clutches, danger was still lurking. She bowed her head, deep in thought. Tommy, what should I do now? I can't let Shadow live in fear forever. Tommy pondered for a moment before replying. You have two choices. One is to seek out an animal rescue organization. There, Shadow will be safe, and you won't have to keep running. But that means you'll have to part with him. Lucy was startled, her heart aching. I can't. Shadow is my family. Or, Tommy continued, you could try to protect him yourself and keep running. But that will be very hard. You still have your mom, Lucy. Are you sure you can handle it? Lucy remained silent, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at Shadow, the dog who had sacrificed so much for her. Shadow's gaze seemed to understand the difficult situation, yet it still radiated absolute trust. Shadow, I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want you to get hurt anymore, Lucy choked out. Open ending. Lucy is facing a tough decision. If you were in her shoes, what would you do? Would you keep Shadow by your side despite all the hardships, or entrust him to a place where he could be better protected? Lucy and Shadow's story isn't just about a dog and a girl. It's a symbol of friendship, loyalty, and sacrifice, values that always exist in life. In today's world, many people find themselves in difficult situations, just as Lucy faces adversity and must make painful decisions. Shadow represents the vulnerable beings who are sometimes abandoned by humans, but remain unconditionally loving and loyal. We also see Jake's image in society, those who care only about their own interests, regardless of the consequences. But the story reminds us that, like Tommy, anyone can change if they discover compassion within themselves. The story poses a question for each of us. In life, are you willing to sacrifice and choose the difficult path for greater values? Are we brave enough to protect what we love, or must we sometimes let go for a better outcome? Take a moment to reflect and let your actions be your answer.